25 to house meetings, rallies, initiations, speakers, and performances, including minstrel shows. The auditorium was in use by the KKK until 1931, when KKK membership dwindled due to a series of sex scandals, internal battles over power, and newspaper exposés, which quickly reduced the group's influence. The building was then used as a department store warehouse, and later as a dance marathon auditorium, a wrestling arena, and a pecan shelling factory. TCU, too, has a relationship to the KKK. This image is taken from our research in the Race and Reconciliation Initiative. And in this May 5th, 1919 front page article from the Skiff entitled Ku Klux Klan Revived, the author describes 50 galloping inhabitants of Clark Hall encircling a TCU women's dormitory in the dark of night and throwing buckets of ice water into its open windows. A bonfire was erected and various Indian dances, too wicked to mention, were performed. The writer continues, "The lull that always comes after the storm eventually followed, and with a few scattered whoops of joy over the prospect of a holiday, the conquerors retired to their cells for the remaining 3 hours of the morning." This event was exalted in Texas Christian University's 1919 yearbook and was characterized as a revival, a ritualized performance of intimidation. Quote, "Yes, the Ku Klux Klan certainly was revived," the author wrote. "That was the finest shirt-tail parade we ever saw." And less than 100 years later, the performance of white nationalism once again pervaded the borders of our campus. In March 2017 and February 2020, Vanguard America and the 100 Handers, individual, anonymous, white nationalist groups, posted flyers around TCU's campus inviting people to take back America and to reject white guilt. When we examine the histories of the systematic annihilation of groups of people, for example, the Holocaust and the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi, I look to this Anti-Defamation League pyramid of hate, which outlines the justification of bias by seeking out like-minded people to accept negative information about other groups of people, purporting said bias as truth. In effect, justifying bias can lead directly to genocide. Performances of white supremacy and white nationalism are powerful tools to keep ideologies of hate, terror, fear, and hegemony intact. On Wednesday, December 22nd, 1920 at 11 p.m., as we look back to history, a mob of 20 armed and masked men who were white kidnapped Tom Vickery, who was also white, from the Tarrant County Jail in Fort Worth and hanged him from a hackberry tree, later known as the Death Tree, at the corner of Northeast 12th Street and Samuels Avenue. Given the iterative performance of kidnapping, hanging, and riddling bodies with bullets, it is believed that the KKK clavern number 101 were responsible for the murder of Tom Vickery. This is a front page article from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram in 1920. Tom Vickery's story and his murder by the KKK brings us to the story of Mr. Fred Rouse. Mr. Fred Rouse was a non-union worker for Swift and Company meatpacking plant in the Nile City stockyards, now known as the Fort Worth stockyards. In the Jim Crow South, only white people were allowed to form and join unions. In 1921, a strike ensued in the stockyards when union laborers demanded higher wages. In response, stockyards slaughterhouse owners hired Black and Latino people to perform union jobs for lower pay and longer hours. This, of course, created tension between union and non-union laborers. White union laborers blamed Black and Latino non-union laborers for stealing their jobs, a trope that continues today. This pressure led to fanatical outrage. On Tuesday, December 6th, 1921, at approximately 4:30 p.m., when leaving work, Mr. Fred Rouse was threatened and accosted by stockyards strikers and agitators. Mr. Rouse was forced to walk through a throng of picketers to enter work and to exit work. One agitator yelled at Mr. Fred Rouse, "You won't be back tomorrow," to which he responded, "I'll be back here at 7:30 in the morning." Mr. Rouse was shoved, then stabbed. As he defended himself from the crowd, a struggle ensued, and Mr. Rouse was accused of shooting 2 white men. A mob then began to beat and bludgeon Mr. Rouse with a streetcar guardrail. With his skull fractured in 2 places, internal injuries, and several stab wounds, Mr. Fred Rouse was left for dead in the middle of Exchange Avenue, right where the large group of people is at the bottom of the stairs, and today from where the cattle are driven in the stockyards twice daily. Nile City police officers asked the mob to relinquish Mr. Rouse to law enforcement. They placed Mr. Rouse's seemingly dead body in the back of a police car when, on the way to the mortuary, discovering that he was still alive, and when Mr. Rouse roused himself from the back seat, they drove him south to the city and county hospital basement Negro ward. 5 days later, while recovering from his injuries, another mob of approximately 30 masked white men entered the hospital on Sunday, December 11th, 1921, almost exactly a year after Tom Vickery was kidnapped and hanged. They threatened the hospital staff They forced their way into the basement Negro ward, and they kidnapped Mr. Rouse in his hospital gown. And they were able to identify him because they knew that they had broken his skull. And they drove north on Samuels Avenue with Mr. Rouse in tow to what had become known as the Death Tree at Northeast 12th Street. The mob hanged Mr. Rouse from the death tree, that tree in this image, and according to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, his body was riddled with bullets. A bloody gun was discovered beneath his feet. The lull that always comes after a storm certainly followed. Likely hundreds drove up and down Samuels Avenue to watch Mr. Rouse's blood let through his city and county hospital nightgown. His broken, leaking body hanging from this hackberry tree, the death tree, was a doleful libation to the long, inevitable future of Black bodies disoriented by white supremacist violence in Fort Worth. Mr. Rouse was buried in New Trinity Cemetery in Haltom City, Texas, the next day on Monday, December 12th, 1921. New Trinity Cemetery was one of the only Black cemeteries in Fort Worth at that time. Little is known about Mr. Rouse's burial, or even if he had a ceremony. No headstone for Mr. Rouse has been located. 6 white men were charged in the murder of Mr. Rouse, including one who had a bar named after him in the stockyards until quite recently, and 3 of whom were law enforcement officers. At least one of these 3 law enforcement officers was known to be a member of Fort Worth's Ku Klux Klan Clavern number 101. All were released, and no one was ever convicted in the murder of Mr. Fred Rouse. While I have found no evidence to substantiate that TCU faculty and students were involved in the lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse in 1921, I believe that we must all be held accountable in his murder. To participate in the historic authenticity of the cultural archive that is Fort Worth, we as a university have an opportunity to look back and to take lead on enacting social change by remembering and reconciling this history in particular. And we look back to put back together the pieces, literally remembering Mr. Rouse's dismemberment. The trauma that occurred the night of December 11th, 1921 lives on in our historical memory, not only through the systematic racist legislation that systemically mistreats people of the global majority, and not only through ever rampant race and class-based segregation, but in the ways that we as Black people are seen and viewed. This occurs as what some term microaggressions, the manner in which racism occurs on minute levels in the grocery store, in schools, at work, in parking lots, and so on. And we know that micro is the new macro. and that small things lead to big things, and that belief systems, if not infiltrated and contradicted, become untruthful understandings and lead directly to genocide. What we know to be happening now is wholly connected to the past and to history, to enslavement and to Jim Crow, and to the performed mistreatment of commodified, capitalized, and pathologized Black bodies. These lasting and unresolved traumatic patterned behaviors have had timeless effects on our communities. And we must understand that it is not only Black communities and communities of color that suffer the effects of historical and contemporary racism. All communities are affected by the mistreatment of another. Racism is pervasive, and no one is immune. I am particularly inspired by the work of attorney Sherilyn A. Eiffel, who in 2003 urged us all to take lead in creating regional and national truth and reconciliation commissions for lynching. In response to attorney Eiffel's charge, I would like to share with you tonight projects that I have been leading as an artist and co-leading as president of Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice, and as co-founder and co-director with my husband, Daniel Banks, of DNA Works. When I began researching the story of Mr. Fred Rouse, I began with the question, what do you know about the story of Mr. Fred Rouse? And most often, the answer was, I know nothing, or I know very little. And as I began to continue to research, I could locate no photographs of Mr. Fred Rouse. And so I decided to use my own body as the canvas on which I would remember him. I took it upon myself to travel to the sites associated with his murder, and I dressed as Mr. Rouse in these locations. The Fort Worth Stockyards, formerly the Nile City Stockyards. The former City and County Hospital. The site of the lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse at Northeast 12th Street and Samuels Avenue. In front of the former Ku Klux Klan Clavern number 101 auditorium. And in New Trinity Cemetery. With photographer Will Wilson of Santa Fe, New Mexico, we use tintype photography as a way to confuse the viewer, both in flipping the image horizontally, but also how we conflate time, connecting anti-Black racial violence as occurred on the body of Mr. Fred Rouse, and all the ways in which I am targeted in this contemporary moment for anti-Black racial violence. These images create a series of photographs called scab. The next project I would like to share with you is one of Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice, or TCCPJ. And this project is called Fred Rouse Memorial Park. In January 2021, TCCPJ purchased the site of the lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse with a generous grant from the Rainwater Charitable Foundation. Fred Rouse Memorial Park will open with a groundbreaking ceremony on the 100th anniversary of the lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse, where we will honor his life and his memory. Fred Rouse Memorial Park will have its official opening ceremony on December 11th, 2022, the 101st anniversary of the lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse. And we welcome you to participate both in the groundbreaking and in the opening and in all of our programming at TCCPJ. The next project I would like to share with you is called Transform 1012 North Main Street. And it is a project to acquire and transform the former Ku Klux Klan Clavern number 101 auditorium. 7 local social justice organizations, including DNA Works, and a shout out again to my husband, co-founder and co-director of DNA Works, Daniel Banks, who has been taking a huge lead in this project, along with Opal Lee's Juneteenth Museum, the Wellman Project, Soul Ballet Folklorico, Window to Your World, Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice, and LGBTQ Saves are part of the 1012 Leadership Coalition, who have co-convened on the project to create what will be known as the Fred Rouse Center and Museum for Arts and Community Healing. The 1012 Leadership Coalition models a pluricultural and shared leadership approach to securing, programming, and managing the space. In so doing, we also bring together groups of people in Fort Worth that are systemically isolated and targeted for oppression. The goals with Transform 1012 North Main Street are to, in Daniel's words, reassemble the city by returning power to groups targeted for oppression, make Fred Rouse Center and Museum for Arts and Community Healing a site of memory, a place for the whole city to come together to wrestle with our history and build a collective way forward toward liberation, and transform our city by transforming this building. We welcome you to participate in Fred Rouse Center and Museum for Arts and Community Healing when we open, hopefully in the next few years. First, we must purchase the building. The last project I offer this evening is entitled Fort Worth Lynching Tour, honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse. Fort Worth Lynching Tour, honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse, is based in the following themes, thematic ideas around activism, remembering, love, transparency, community, and healing. And it is a bike tour and a bus tour led with groups to the sites associated with the 1921 lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse in Fort Worth, Texas. As part of Fort Worth Lynching Tour honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse, We visit 4 sites together as a community to remember, to pay homage, to notice, to learn, and to activate restorative justice. The tour is accompanied by a downloadable augmented reality app that is used in each of the sites to research and discover the history of Mr. Rouse's death. The app is the most robust standing document that we have that tells the story of Mr. Rouse. We use the app to enact what I call embodied anti-racism by inviting users to, for example, swipe away the crowd at the stockyards before they attack Mr. Fred Rouse, allowing Mr. Fred Rouse to walk home to his family. And so I'd like to share a little bit of the Fort Worth lynching tour honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse augmented reality app with you now. This is our opening page. And we've mapped each one of the locations. Users can click on any location and it will take the user to a pop-up page where you have a concise paragraph related to that space. And then you have the basic page that outlines more of the history related to that site. And one can click on research, where one is taken to historical documentation. One can zoom in and learn more about each site. This here is the death certificate of Mr. Fred Rouse. You see there that he's listed as a butcher, as well as other images. These are headstones from New Trinity Cemetery, and you see here that they are handwritten. One can then click on Discover, which engages the app, and here we have a personal narrative from Miss Opal Lee.
I am a 94-year-old going on 95. So I've been around a long time.
And this Discover from 1012 North Main Street.
Formed by earth and laid with hands, an intention was set here. And like you now, the land was a witness. Brick by brick by brick, it held the toxic weight of our human hate, our trembling hope, our violent desperation, and it holds it still. The costs and the receipts, the price that was paid by the trees no longer seen, the vibrant and colorful beings that can barely breathe. Spirits wait to be freed by our living, our healing out loud, our collective remembering, the archive right under our feet, the forced complicity of a hackberry tree, the weaponizing of our death, the overgrown architecture of our pain. It is here where we stand as a monument to our becoming, that the land gracefully holds us up and the air selflessly offers you another breath and a choice, here and now, and every breath forward, to let the water heal and to honor the sanctity of the living.
And here we welcome people to swipe away the crowd on the screen, which unveils and allows Mr. Rouse to walk home to his family.
the darkness into the light of a million dreams. I was broken, but now I believe.
And a shout out to Digital Ant Media in Santa Fe, New Mexico, who are the app developers. We commissioned artists from around the United States to offer their respects to Mr. Rouse by creating responses to the sites associated with the lynching of Mr. Fred Rouse. And a shout out to Marie-Tree Garrett, who was singing the last song. The goal of Fort Worth Lynching Tour honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse is to generate community healing through memorial activism. This transformational experience invites participants to ask what, how, why, and whom do we remember? Following the tour, we host a community story circle for audience members to process the tour experience together and to share stories of resistance, resilience, and healing. DNA Works welcomes you to participate in Fort Worth Lynching Tour honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse during a special bus tour specifically for TCU community members. And it's happening on Saturday, April 17th. That 11 should be 1/7. You'll have to excuse me. At 1 p.m. That is Saturday, April 17th at 1 p.m. specifically for TCU. Fort Worth Lynching Tour honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse bus tour for TCU is co-sponsored by RRI, the Office of Inclusiveness and Intercultural Studies, and the Black Faculty and Staff Association. To register for Fort Worth Lynching Tour honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse, please go to www.tinyurl.com/TCUFWLT. Again, to register for Fort Worth Lynching Tour honoring the memory of Mr. Fred Rouse bus tour on Saturday, April 17th, 1 to 5 p.m. It's free admission and free food. Please go to www.tinyurl.com/TCUFWLT. I will say that we've been leading the tour for the past 3 weekends and will be doing so for the next 3 weekends. And it's been beautiful to watch people learn about this history and to make connections to our present moment. And I've watched people leave hopeful, and that is our interest. That's not to re-traumatize, but it's absolutely and actually about offering creative solutions to move forward. And I hope that these examples of truth and reconciliation work to embody anti-racism offer potential and pragmatic solutions of memorial activism as responses to the histories of anti-Black racial terror violence in Fort Worth, Texas. Thank you so much again for having me this evening. It's been such a pleasure to share this work with you. Marcellus.
Mr. Perkins, I have a quick question to ask of Adam, and I will listen to the answer when I watch the recording, as I do unfortunately have to get going. But Adam, a two-part question, and that is, A, you're doing a lot of cool shit, excuse my expression. I mean, you know, when you look at the videos, the filming, the dancing, the music, all these components. My question, the first part is, how do you pace yourself in terms of finding time and energy to be creative? Because being creative takes energy. How do you pace yourself to do that and fulfill your full-time job, which is obviously being a fabulous professor? How do you pace yourself in terms of coming up with these ideas and executing them and seeing them through? And then the second part is, as you're executing your ideas, how do you go about people just still having trouble processing the idea that a Black man was lynched in Tarrant County technically less than a century ago? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. G. In answer to your first question, this is my research. Art is my research. And the question around balance is an interesting one, because I don't feel that I actually have a good balance of work and life. Though at DNA Works, we are in the process of hiring a managing director, so that's pretty exciting to continue to balance that. But my interest is to make this history known, merely because it's not. And because Black histories are decentralized. And that is a vestige of colonial discourse. And so to place this history at the center of our cultural memory resists racism. And for me as an artist, that is my platform of both expression and research. In answer to your second question, Dr. Gooding, the truth will set us free. And looking back is not easy. It brings up feelings for good reason, and the feelings are there to be felt. When we don't feel our feelings, it impedes our thinking and it impedes our actions. And that's why I think the arts are the perfect lens through which we can look back, to feel and to notice. And all that I can do is put the work out there, and then people can choose to look back with me and with us together, like the Sankofa, or not. And I think that the earth will be a better place when we look back together.
Wow, Professor McKinney, one, I just have to say thank you for that amazing presentation. Thank you for your energy, time, and effort, for involving yourself so intimately with this work. We do have a couple questions that I want to get to from someone in the audience. Someone asked, does the hospital that Mr. Fred Rouse went to still exist? And if so, do they have any memorial for him there?
That is a great question, and I'll share my screen once more quickly. In answer to that question, anonymous attendee, the former city and county hospital does still stand, and it is this photograph. Thank you for your patience. It is in this photograph that I share here. This is the former city and county hospital that still stands at 4th and Jones Street. You can see here the stairs leading down to the basement level. I don't believe that those stairs are original, but this basement level was the Negro ward. At present, there is no historical marker at this site. We are in conversation with Performing Arts Fort Worth, who owns this building and adjacent buildings, to have a conversation about installing a historical marker there. I will say that Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice is one of the community remembrance projects of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And what it means to be a community remembrance project means that people in cities and counties who are interested in memorializing victims of lynchings come together to create their own coalitions and are then funded by the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, to install historical markers at various sites around the United States. So at Fred Rouse Memorial Park, for example, there will be a two-sided Equal Justice Initiative historical marker. When we acquire and then transform 1012 North Main Street, the Fred Rouse Center and Museum for Arts and Community Healing, there will be some sort of historical marker there. I see these historical markers around our city almost like acupuncture needles, where we get to implant history and truth and twist them a little bit to balance, to both change and balance the energies of our local sites.
Wow. So I do want to acknowledge some messages of gratitude. One from Amanda Stallings just saying, this is wonderful. Thank you. And Christine Queen, just gratitude to Adam for his work and for his grace in sharing this research. I can't imagine sharing this information and not becoming emotional. Thank you. We do have one more question. Does Fred Rouse still have family in the Fort Worth area?
Yes, thank you, Melinda, for that question. Mr. Fred Rouse I does have family in the Fort Worth area, as well as south of Fort Worth. And we are very much in contact with members of Mr. Fred Rouse's family, one of whom sits on our executive board of Tarrant County Coalition for Peace and Justice. Placing family members at the center of this work is important and essential, and we would not be doing this work if family members weren't at the center. It just wouldn't make sense. And having their permission and their go-ahead has also been central to our moving forward toward reconciling this history.
Professor McKinney, as you were, presenting and telling the story of Mr. Fred Rouse, I instantly thought of 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And in the context of today and looking at the trial of what we have going on with the Charbonneau trial and thinking of the life of Mr. George Floyd, how do you find that these two instances, and countless and many others, but more so I ask just because of the whole world saw 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a police officer placing his knee at the back of someone's neck who pleaded for their life. How do you find that moment or this current reality in relation to the story of Mr. Fred Rouse and how they're so interconnected, but at times so distant in the grand scheme of years?
I feel like I've done a lot of talking, Marcellus. Do you want to answer that question?
As I've watched your presentation and I see the reality of what we're living through right now, I've realized that time and location have no matters when it comes to the destruction of Black humanity. No matter if we're in New York City, if we're in Fort Worth, Texas, if we are in Los Angeles, California, if we're in Virginia Beach, Virginia, if the year is 1921, 1963, or 2021, that we have a constant repetitive action attack on Black humanity that knows no location, knows no time, and knows no grace. So I guess in me asking you this question, I guess that I'm trying to search for some type of comfort that there may be an end to the attack and that there may be space for Black humanity to actually exist in its fullness. But I don't have an answer to my own question. I just have pauses in my thought. And I don't know if it's me waiting for the next one to happen or if I'm just searching for a possibility that it may end. And that's it. That's all I could think of.
That's beautiful. You know, I shared about doing my research and going around and asking people questions. And the fact that we don't know is by design.
Mm.
When we forget, when we don't know our history, it's that much more easy to oppress us.
Mm.
And essentially target us for genocide because we become or have become, as part of that colonial discourse, not even 5/5 of a man.
Mm.
And those ideas are still part of our quilting and our cultural language, the language we have, the practices we have. And so I'm thinking about consoling.
Mm.
And that, you know, my interest is to say we're safe. And that is not always the case. But in doing this work, I have to hold that out.
Mm.
I have to hold out that the white people around me will keep me safe. Because if not, we will forget to remember.
Mm. Wow. Wow. Professor McKinney, I feel as though I could, there's so many more questions that I have, but just in the interest of time, and I just want to be respectful to everyone's evening, I think we'll conclude with those closing statements. And for everyone who has attended tonight, I just want to thank you all for your participation, your time, energy, and effort. Professor McKinney, again, I thank you personally on behalf of RRI, just for you showing up in this space and investing and including your work and sharing your work with us. This is this is an emotional piece of work. This isn't sitting behind a computer and reading and writing, but you put yourself literally in the physical location in which these tragedies happen. So I thank you for being ever so brave and courageous.
You're welcome. And I will just say this, that it is also sitting behind a computer and reading and writing.
Yeah.
That the research process is both embodied and creative and text-based. And so thank you for noticing. And I would like to invite everyone again at TCU to come on Fort Worth Lynching Tour. It's really an amazing, amazing project. Free food, free admission, Saturday, April 17th, 1 to 5 p.m. And again, to register, go to www.tinyurl.com/TCUFWLT. Thanks again, Marcellus, for having me. This was really special.
Absolutely. And before we close, I invite everyone to the screening of Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th tomorrow at 7 p.m. in the campus commons, as well as for the Firth Worth Hills, which is in the back of campus, as well as to check out our website periodically for more updates and informations and engaging conversations as they take place as we move towards Reconciliation Day on April 21st. And last, Dr. G and I host a podcast entitled Reconcile This, where we do these conversations. We continue these conversations. We highlight who we consider the champions of our campus, who are doing the work day in and day out of reconciliation. With that being said, I will close with this effort of reconciliation is a day-by-day effort to show up, be honest and transparent in order for us to be held accountable for a better future of TCU. We can't promise that we'll answer every question. We can't promise that we'll fix every issue, but please trust that we are doing the best we can with what we have. Until next time.